Welcome to another deep dive with us. You know, we love digging into these developer-focused talks, and you all sent in a great one, Tim Pettersen's presentation from API Days in Hong Kong.
Yeah, this one was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, 17 years at Atlassian, that's like almost as old as Jira itself, right?
Basically, yeah.
So he's really seen it all, and the evolution of APIs and how that's all played into their platform, right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me right away listening to him was just how important having a really thriving ecosystem is for a company like Atlassian.
Okay, so what does that look like? You mean like partnerships and stuff?
Yeah, partnerships, but in a very strategic way.
Yeah.
So take Jira, for example. They've got this whole open toolchain philosophy where they're actively partnering with all sorts of other players in the software development world.
Okay, so like who are we talking about here?
Git service providers, DevOps platforms, security firms, like anyone who's doing anything related to building and shipping software, there's a good chance Atlassian's got a partnership or integration with them.
And all of this is happening through their API platforms, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, the APIs are the glue that holds it all together.
Interesting. So it's not just about building a great product in isolation. It's about weaving a web of interconnected tools that all work seamlessly together.
Exactly. And their commercial marketplace is a testament to that. They've got all these independent developers building and selling apps that enhance Atlassian products. And get this, they've actually surpassed $3 billion in lifetime sales.
Whoa, that's insane.
Right. It just shows you the power of a really well-cultivated ecosystem.
For sure. But it's not all about external partners either, right?
Good point. Atlassian is super proactive about encouraging their own customers to build custom integrations and workflow automations using their APIs.
I hadn't thought about that angle.
And you know what's crazy? They found that customers who do this kind of stuff, who really get in there and tailor the software to their needs, they're way more likely to stick around long term.
Oh, that makes sense.
You're not just a user, you're like invested in the platform.
It's like instead of waiting for Atlassian to develop a specific feature, you can just go ahead and build it yourself.
Precisely. But of course, as with any evolving technology, there are always some bumps in the road. Yeah.
What are some of the challenges they've run into?
Well, like a lot of software companies these days, they're transitioning to a cloud-first model, even going as far as sunsetting their server products.
Trying to get everyone onto the cloud.
Yep, exactly. But, it's not always a smooth transition.
Is it just like resistance to change, or is there more to it than that?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. On the one hand, you've got some customers who are hesitant to make the move because their favorite apps haven't made the jump to the cloud yet.
Ah, I see.
And then on the flip side, you have some developers, especially smaller ones, who've been kind of slow to port their server apps over to the cloud.
So it's like a chicken and egg situation.
Totally. Some customers are waiting for their apps, and some developers are hesitant to invest if they aren't sure their customers will follow.
What a mess.
Yeah, to really understand where this hesitation comes from, we need to step back and look at how Atlassian's APIs have evolved over time.
Let's do it. Take us back to the beginning.
All right, picture this. It's 2002, Jira's just launched, and back then, there was no cloud versus server distinction.
Right, the cloud was barely a thing back then.
Exactly. So Jira starts getting popular, users want more and more features, and you know what they did?
What? Did they just release a ton of updates?
Even better, they had a really permissive source license. Like users could actually modify the source code of Jira themselves.
No way. So they could like tweak it to their liking and then recompile it and everything.
Yep. Total flexibility, but you can imagine it also caused some, shall we say, stability issues.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster if everyone's just messing around with the core code.
Right. So in 2008, they introduced a plugin system, which was revolutionary.
Ah, that makes more sense.
Plugins were isolated packages with clearer API boundaries. Everything became way more stable and predictable.
I can see how that would have been a game changer.
Big time. And it really laid the foundation for the ecosystem we see today. It's amazing how something that started with users literally hacking the source code evolved into this intricate network of apps and integrations.
It is pretty wild.
And as Jira kept evolving, they built out REST APIs to enable more sophisticated integrations.
Makes sense.
They added platform components, storage capabilities, better developer tools, all that good stuff.
So they were really paving the way for a vibrant developer community.
Yeah, and this approach worked wonders for their server products. Developers could build some pretty complex apps with relatively minimal code because the platform was handling all the heavy lifting, authentication, storage, even UI elements.
So the platform itself was like a force multiplier for developers.
Absolutely. But then came the cloud, and, well, things got a bit trickier.
Right. That was kind of inevitable, wasn't it?
In 2014, they launched their first cloud API platform, Atlassian Connect.
Okay, so what was that like?
It relied on REST APIs and webhooks,
Yeah.
which was pretty standard at the time. For UI extensibility, they introduced this iframe-based system.
Right. iframes, I remember those.
So you could build a lot of different kinds of cloud apps, but it also came with new challenges.
Okay, what were the pain points for developers?
Well, to build even a basic cloud app, you now needed a full-fledged web application, which was a big shift from the simplicity of the server environment.
So it was a much bigger lift for developers.
Oh, yeah, and then they had to worry about scaling their app for potentially thousands of customers simultaneously.
Right, that's a whole different ballgame.
Totally. And this actually reflects a broader trend in the SaaS world. Building for a cloud ecosystem often means managing a separate web service that interacts with the platform through APIs and webhooks.
So even with all of Atlassian's efforts to provide SDKs and libraries and better APIs, it still wasn't as easy or as powerful as their server platform had been.
Exactly, and that had real consequences. Some developers, especially the smaller marketplace partners and those doing in-house development, they just felt like the effort to port their apps to the cloud was too high, and they kind of opted out.
Totally understandable.
Yeah, it's a business decision at the end of the day.
And I bet Atlassian noticed that, right? Like a drop-off in app development.
Oh, absolutely. They saw a decline in the level of in-house app development happening in the cloud compared to server.
Yeah.
And that's when they realized they needed a new approach if they wanted to truly empower their cloud ecosystem and make it as attractive as their server platform had been.
I'm sensing a but coming.
But they also needed to address the growing concerns around security and trust in cloud environments. It wasn't just about making things easier for developers. It was also about establishing a really strong trust story for their platform.
Okay, so how did they tackle that challenge? What was their next move?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. That's a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. Can't wait to hear what they came up with.
Yeah, me both. So where we left off, Atlassian realized they needed to take on more of the heavy lifting when it came to cloud app development.
Instead of just handing developers the API keys and saying, good luck.
Right, exactly. They were already super invested in security and trust for their own cloud products, so they figured, why not extend that to our ecosystem partners too?
It's like, if we're going to ask developers to build on our platform, let's make sure it's a solid foundation they can trust.
Yeah, create a truly hosted ecosystem platform where they manage all the infrastructure and security, and developers just focus on the app itself.
I can see how that would be appealing.
And they look at a few different options for how to actually make this happen.
Like what? Just give everyone a slice of AWS?
That was one idea. Especially since they're so tight with AWS, they considered providing these managed AWS accounts to their ecosystem partners.
So each developer gets like their own little sandbox to play in on AWS?
Exactly. But they also explored a platform as a service model, or PaaS.
Okay, so that's like one level of abstraction up, right?
Right.
Instead of managing raw AWS resources, you're working with a more structured platform.
Precisely, developers would package up their web applications, probably in Docker containers, and Atlassian would handle running those containers in their cloud environment.
Gotcha. So a bit more hands-off for the developer.
They even considered a functions as a service model, or phase, which takes the abstraction even further.
Now hold on. Functions as a service, that's a new one for me. Break that down for us simple folk.
Sure thing. With phase, you're deploying individual functions or bundles of functions that represent the logic of your app. These are like little building blocks of code that get triggered by certain events or requests.
Okay, so instead of deploying a whole web app, you're deploying these smaller, more modular pieces.
Exactly. And AWS Lambda and Google Cloud Functions are some well-known examples of phase platforms.
So did they end up going with the Phase-S approach?
They did. After weighing the pros and cons of each option, they decided to go all in on phase, and they named this new platform Atlassian Forge.
Catchy name. But is it really just Face? You mentioned earlier it was closer to Integration Platform as a Service, or iPaaS, right?
You're right. It actually goes beyond a typical Faces offering.
Yeah.
They've built in all these specialized features and abstractions that are specifically designed to make it easy to build apps that integrate with Atlassian products.
So it's tailored for the Atlassian ecosystem.
Precisely. And this decision was driven by two main goals.
Okay, hit me with those.
Number one, they wanted to make cloud app development accessible to basically everyone.
Everyone. You mean like even non-developers?
Ideally, yes. Imagine a system administrator being able to customize their Jira instance without needing to be a coding whiz.
Oh, wow. So democratizing development within an organization.
Exactly. And the second big goal was to establish a super strong trust story for Forge.
Like, we can trust these third-party apps as much as we trust Atlassian's own products.
Exactly. And security and reliability were paramount to that vision.
Okay, so developer-friendly and super secure. Those are some lofty goals.
They are. And to achieve them, the first thing they had to do is abstract away all the underlying infrastructure and operational complexity.
All the stuff that would normally give a developer a headache.
Precisely. In the old cloud platform, developers had to worry about load balancers, microservices, databases, all these things that are essential for running a web application on the public internet.
Yeah, keeping a cloud app running smoothly for thousands of users is not a trivial task.
Not at all. So with Forge, they wanted to create a scenario where a developer could literally write a simple JavaScript function, deploy it to Atlassian's cloud, and have it work seamlessly for one customer or 10,000 customers without any additional effort.
Now, that's a compelling vision, but is it actually realistic?
That's the beauty of it. It actually is. And AWS Lambda has been a great fit for that, it's that serverless platform.
Right. Serverless is all about abstracting away the servers so developers don't have to worry about them.
Exactly. And Lambda allows you to deploy these functions that can scale up on demand and then scale back down to zero when they're not in use, which is great for keeping costs under control.
Ah, so it's efficient and cost-effective. That's a win-win.
And the beauty is that developers can do all sorts of things with these functions. They can react to events happening within Atlassian products, like when a Jira issue gets created or updated.
Right.
They can schedule functions to run at certain time. They can create all sorts of compute tasks. It's incredibly versatile.
So it's like giving them this toolkit of building blocks that they can assemble into all sorts of custom functionality.
Exactly. No more managing infrastructure. Operational tasks like logging and metrics are all simplified.
So it's a lot less overhead for developers. They can just focus on building their app.
And you know what else is great about abstracting away all that infrastructure? It actually helps a ton with security.
That's right. We were talking about security earlier.
Because these functions aren't directly exposed to the public internet, they're much harder for attackers to target. Plus, they're ephemeral, meaning they only exist for a short time before being shut down by AWS.
So even if someone did manage to compromise a function, they wouldn't have much time to exploit it before it disappears.
Exactly. And because Atlassian controls the whole deployment process, they can do a much better job of monitoring and scanning the code for potential vulnerabilities.
That's a big improvement over the old way where the app was often a black box running on the developer's own infrastructure.
For sure. It's a win-win in terms of security and trust.
Makes sense. And all this simplification probably makes it way easier for developers to get started with building apps, right?
Absolutely. With Forge, you can bootstrap an app really quickly using these pre-built templates that give you a foundation to work with.
So it's like, here's a basic structure, now go wild and build your awesome app.
Exactly. And they're actively developing some really cool features to further enhance the security and data residency aspects of the platform.
Oh, tell me more about those. This is getting interesting.
So one initiative they're working on is deploying Lambda functions to every AWS region where Atlassian has customers.
Okay, so what's the advantage of that?
It means that apps can run closer to the users they serve, which improves performance and can potentially help with certain data residency requirements.
Makes sense. And they're also working on making their storage APIs automatically comply with customer data residency policies. So they're taking data privacy and localization seriously.
Oh yeah, it's a top priority, especially for large enterprises that have strict compliance requirements.
I can see how this would be a huge selling point for them. This is all sounding pretty amazing. But it can't all be sunshine and roses, can it?
You're right. There are definitely some trade-offs to consider with this Forge approach. This is not a silver bullet solution by any means.
Okay, so what are the downsides?
Well, serverless functions, while incredibly powerful, can be a bit opinionated in how you design your software.
So they're not necessarily a good fit for every single use case?
Exactly. Right. For example, if you wanted to run complex AI models natively within Forge, that wouldn't really be feasible right now.
So you'd need to stick with a more traditional web application approach for something like that.
And retrofitting serverless functions into an existing web app can be quite a challenge too.
So for some of Atlassian's existing partners who want to migrate to Forge, it's not just a simple flip of a switch.
Unfortunately not. It's a pretty big undertaking.
What other challenges should we be aware of?
Well, building and maintaining this whole hosted platform is a huge investment for Atlassian.
Right. I mean, Lambda might be handling a lot of the heavy lifting, but they still had to build a pretty complex set of tools and APIs on top of it.
Exactly. And that requires a lot of R&D and operational expertise.
It's not a trivial thing to pull off, for sure,
Yeah.
but the early results are promising, right?
Very. They're seeing strong demand for Forge apps, especially from those enterprise customers.
Which makes sense, given all the security and data privacy features we've been talking about.
Totally. And there have been some pretty impressive developer success stories, too. I read about one partner who built and launched a Forge app in just 2 months, and they had zero prior experience with Atlassian APIs.
Wow, so that speaks to the ease of use of the platform.
Right. So while it's still early days, Forge has the potential to be a real game changer for the Atlassian ecosystem and maybe even for the SaaS landscape as a whole.
Absolutely. I'm curious, though, where do you see this whole platformization trend heading in the future?
Well, that's a big question, and one we'll explore more in the next part. But for now, I'll just say that I think we're going to see a lot more of this kind of thing in the coming years.
As we've been talking about this whole Forge thing, one thing that keeps coming back to me is just how much emphasis Atlassian has put on the whole security and trust aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just about making development easier. They've really gone above and beyond to address those specific security challenges that come with cloud-based app ecosystems.
Okay, so can you give me like a concrete example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure. One of the key aspects of Forge is this thing called network isolation, right? So Forge apps, they run in a very restricted environment where all outbound network connections are tightly controlled.
So it's like putting those apps in a sandbox where they can't just connect to any server on the internet?
Exactly. And the idea is to minimize that potential attack surface. So even if an app were to be compromised, the damage they could do would be limited.
Right, because they can only talk to a very specific set of approved services.
And what's cool is that this list of allowed domains is actually transparent to customers.
Oh, that's a nice touch. So you can see exactly where an app is allowed to send data before you install it.
Exactly. It helps build that trust and transparency, which is really important when you're dealing with third-party apps.
Absolutely. So what else? What other security measures did they bake into Forge?
Well, another big one is tenancy isolation.
Right.
Making sure that data from one customer's site can't leak into another's.
Right. That's crucial for maintaining confidentiality and all that.
Especially for those bigger companies that might be dealing with really sensitive information.
Makes sense.
And they've also simplified the whole authentication process, which used to be a real pain point for developers and a potential source of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier, all that stuff with shared secrets and webhooks and tokens flying around.
It's a mess.
Yeah.
But with Forge, all of that complexity is handled by the platform itself, so developers don't have to worry about it.
So a win-win for both security and developer sanity.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned network isolation earlier. I'm kind of curious, how does that actually work under the hood?
Oh, good question. So to achieve that level of isolation, all those Forge functions are deployed into a lockdown virtual private cloud, or VPC, on AWS.
Oh, okay, see.
And all outbound network connections are routed through a thing called a data address proxy.
What's that?
It basically acts as a gatekeeper, and it only allows connections to a pre-approved list of domains.
Oh, clever. So even if an app tries to do something shady, like connect to some suspicious server, the proxy will just block it.
Exactly. It's like an extra layer of protection.
But that also means Atlassian has to provide all the operational tooling and analytics that developers would normally get from those third-party services.
Right. It's a trade-off, but one that ultimately benefits everyone in terms of security.
Makes sense. And what about tenancy isolation? How do they manage to make sure that data from different customers is truly kept separate?
That was a bit of a technical challenge, right? Because by default, AWS Lambda reuses function instances across different invocations, which could potentially lead to some data leakage between tenants.
Oh, yeah, that wouldn't be good.
So to address that, they had to build this whole specialized sandbox environment on top of Lambda, where each instance is completely destroyed after every function invocation.
Whoa, okay, that's serious commitment to data isolation.
It is. It guarantees that no data or state is carried over between different customer sites.
Wow, I'm impressed.
Yeah.
But I imagine that must create some limitations for developers too, right?
Yeah, it definitely does. Certain caching mechanisms that rely on persisting data between invocations become much harder to implement.
Makes sense.
And it also limits those use cases where sharing data across sites might actually be a desirable thing.
Right, so it's always a balancing act between security and functionality.
Absolutely. But overall, it sounds like Atlassian has done a really impressive job of prioritizing security and data privacy with Forge.
Couldn't agree more. And you know what? The early results speak for themselves, especially those enterprise customers who are typically very sensitive about security and compliance. They've been really enthusiastic about Forge apps.
That's a good sign.
Yeah, it shows that Atlassian's on the right track.
They're building something that people actually trust and want to use.
And even though it's a complex process, Atlassian is also working hard to make the migration process to Forge as smooth as possible for their existing partners.
That's great to hear. They're really in it for the long haul. Well, it's been an incredible journey talking about all this. We've covered a lot of ground, starting from the early days of Jira and those source code modifications to the emergence of Forge and all the implications it has for the future of these SaaS ecosystems.
Totally. It just goes to show how much things have changed in the world of software development.
For sure. As we wrap things up, I'm curious what you think this whole platformization trend means for the future of software development. Are we headed toward a world where everything is built on these face platforms? Or will there always be a need for those custom-built web apps?
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer. I think it's probably going to be a mix of both, right? There are definitely some big advantages to using face platforms like Forge, simplicity, security, scalability, but there will always be those use cases where the flexibility and control of a custom-built web application are just essential.
It's about picking the right tool for the job.
And for developers working in the Atlassian ecosystem, Forge is definitely a platform worth exploring. It has the potential to really streamline development, enhance security, and open up some really interesting new avenues for innovation.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Forge is definitely something to keep an eye on. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of SaaS platforms, APIs, and the rise of Atlassian Forge.
It's been a pleasure.
I hope you all found it as insightful as we did and feel inspired to learn more about this ever-evolving landscape of software development. Until next time, keep on coding and keep on diving deep.